Hi there everyone, welcome to another one of my little tutorials. I'll move that, it's to remind me not to say or basically. Sarah's in the background, she's going to help me with the live feeds in October and you'll get to meet her personally, but now she might just barracking me every time I say or basically. So now we've got that one out of the way. My last little video, oh I said it. Thanks, thank you for your support. Oh, I did it again. That's an outtake, I think. Okay, my last video was about the most common mistakes in watercolour, and I was urging everybody not to give up on watercolour painting. Just by... Cut! Take two. Thank you for watching another of my videos. Yesterday I did, or a couple of days ago, I did one on encouraging people not to give up on watercolour painting. And when I watched it back, I realised that there was something really important that I'd missed. So I thought I'd do a second one to describe it in a bit more depth. Guess the question is it better to paint too wet or too dry in watercolours? And the answer is definitely it's better to paint too wet. At the risk of having blooms and cauliflowers like this one that we did, and that's how it ended up, it's better to have blooms that you can actually correct later on in the painting than to paint too dry. If you end up painting too dry, you end up with patches, you end up with uneven washes. It makes it more stressful because you've got to paint a lot faster. So it's definitely better to paint too wet. Now, if I just describe the process of, I didn't really touch on this yesterday or on my last video, I'm going to add some water to this. And what happens is you can see that I talk about that this should be the consistency of milk. Now there's all sorts of milk, there's skinny milk, right up to gold top milk, and this is way too watery. But what I wanted to do, oh I've just sprayed my paper, let's just turn that over. I just wanted to describe both processes to you. Now most beginners do one or the other. They either have it too fluid, so too watery like this, or they have it too dry. And what puts most people off painting watercolour painting is that it's the uncontrollable thing that happens once you wet the paper. Now this paper's not taped down, but let's put some water on here. And usually I paint, let's make it a bit deeper so you can see it better. And I would recommend that you paint on an angle. Now if you paint too wet, what happens is when you tip your board at an angle of about 15 degrees, you get this happening. Let's just encourage it because it's not wanting to go. And that's what causes panic in newcomers to watercolour painting. It's all that uncontrollable stuff that you think, and I hear gasps if I'm in a class and it happens. So the alternative to that is to paint too dry. So what we end up with here is an uncontrollable puddle that you can't really control. You run the risk of back runs, it's all very fluid, you end up with things running down all over the place, and that's what causes the panic. But the alternative to that is to actually paint too dry. So I'm just going to mop this moisture out of here so I can mix a wash that's really too thick. So this one is, I'll mix some of this with it. So this would stay fluid. If you remember the golden time from my last video, this would stay fluid for quite a long time. And it's better to have that than the alternative, which is this. So if you paint too dry, as soon as it comes off the brush, you can see how dry that is, because I'm actually having a dry brush marks there. As soon as it's come off the brush, it's basically lost, oh I said basically, it's lost all of its, Sarah's in the background chuckling, it's lost all its fluidity, the shine's starting to go off that paper almost immediately, so you don't get any time. If you paint more wet, like on this side, it means that you've got more time. Doing it this way, you don't have any time at all. So there's no time for lifting off, there's no time for adding other colours to it, which is part of the beauty of watercolour painting. And it makes it more difficult to paint if you have a tendency to paint too dry. The right kind of fluidity that you want on your painting is something that's controllable. So if you mix this paint, and let's just add a little more water to it, you can check the consistency of the paint by just dragging the brush up onto the side of the dish, and can you see it kind of holds together? So this is about silver top milk, I would think. It's quite rich in consistency, and if you paint with this consistency of paint, generally speaking, you get a lot more time. The other thing to do is to make sure you use nice smooth brush strokes. If you hear the sound, it means it's time to dip into the paint, and you've got an overall sheen of paint. Dip into the paint again, so you have more time. So this one's almost dry, but this one is going to stay fluid for a lot longer. So if you wanted to do, you could do some lifting off on a wash that's like this for quite some time. I think I timed it yesterday and it was going to be 2 or 3 minutes. So it means that every section of your painting you've got to complete in 2 or 3 minutes. Now if, let's say you were painting a section, and I'll just get an example actually of one that I've done. Sometimes if you're in a hurry, like this was done pretty much on location, and if you look very closely here you can see little white gaps between the washes, particularly around this area here. So it means that you can paint this area, and then if you paint this area, if you just leave the tiniest of white gaps, you can carry on without it risking bleeding into the other wash. So that's kind of an example of how you can do it if you were, say, painting on location. So generally speaking, you start off with wet into wet washes. So let's say we were doing a sky, so we'd wet the paper first, preferably with clean water, and then you'd add some paint to it, and this is how you'd paint a sky. So it generally starts with a fairly moist brush, kind of silver top paint and wet paper, and that gives you time. And what happens then is, as you move forward in the painting, the brushes get smaller and smaller and the washes get thicker and thicker, because you want to try and get some distance in your paintings. So you start off with big floppy brushes and wet into wet washes, and then as you move forward in the painting, the paint gets darker and the brushes get smaller, and that's how you get the definition in the foreground and in the focus of interest in the painting. And it's usually with thicker paint and smaller brushes, but these come right at the end. So dry brush techniques, like let's say you were using a rigger, so you wanted the fine lines of, say, a fence or something like that, or you wanted some texture on water. All these techniques come right at the very end of the painting. So it's generally speaking about, let's say, a soft brush, wet into wet for the sky, let that dry. Then if you wanted hard edges on mountains, you'd paint that also with a round brush. So you'd let it dry and then paint the mountains with a slightly deeper paint. And then you'd move forward in the painting, thickening the paint as you come forward into the foreground. And you'd also warm up the foregrounds as well, with because cool colours tend to recede, so cooler colours would tend to be pushed back in the painting and warmer colours jump forward in the painting, and it's usually that recession that gives you a nice balance of distance, or what is the name for it? I can't remember. I know Ron Ranson used it quite a lot. Counter change, I think no, that's another thing, that's contrast. Anyway, I'm rambling. Are you laughing? Okay. If you want to extend the drying time, by the way, if your paint does start to dry up and you want to extend it, you can just give it a light spray with a spray bottle like this or usually I use a smaller one, and that extends the life of it. It's kind of called breathing life into the painting. If you watch, there's a video by, I think it's Joseph Zbudvik and Alvaro Castagne and Herman Penkel, I think it's called. Anyway, it's called The Three Amigos. Check it out, because they paint an absolutely massive scene, all three of them together, and you'll see how they keep spraying it with water to keep it alive, and that way you don't get a muddy looking painting. So all you do is literally spray the wash, and then it gives you more time. So I hope that's been helpful, and tune in again, and I'll try not to say or basically. And thanks for your support, Sarah. Bye.